everyone, this is Jill Hurston with Synerzip. I'm the Marketing Director welcoming you to our webinar today. I'd like to first of all remind you that I am recording this session and it will be available on our website tomorrow. Everybody will get an email from me with the direct link to the recording and to the presentation. If at any time during the presentation you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. With that being said, I'd like to introduce Mike Watson, who is Synerzip's VP of Engineering. He will be moderating today's session. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Jill, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Scaling Agile Teams. Our webinar today provides some insights into the question of what do we do as your Agile team grows? I think this is an interesting topic because it's not always clear exactly how to stay agile as your team grows and your business expands. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Ron Lichty. Ron has been a VP of Engineering, a VP of Product, and a CTO, and these days advises businesses and engineering leaders on how to untangle the knots in their software development. With that, Ron, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Mike. So this is Ron Lichty. I am the co-author of one of the very few books on managing programmers and managing teams. So it turns out there are just scads and scads of books on managing software development projects, but almost none on managing the people who actually deliver the software development projects. And so that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today is how to organize the people. We turned our book into video training. So both of these were published through Addison Wesley and Pearson. If you're on O'Reilly's Safari library, you've got access to both of them. I'm also the co-author of the Study of Product Team Performance. So there's a URL down there at the bottom where you can get access to the studies and to the summaries of the studies and to some of what I think are some of the more interesting things that we found. I'm sharing this because I expect to be sharing a couple of things that we found through the Study of Product Team Performance as we go along. I have been at a bunch of companies through my career. I was a software developer. After 6 years of software development, thought I had the best job in the whole world, but I wanted to try managing. And Apple Computer made me the offer to come manage a product management group in development tools. That kind of crossover between highly technical and product management. I spent about 1.5 years doing product management of development tools, went back to programming, became a programming manager, went back to programming, became a programming manager, stayed at Apple and managed the team that did the UX of the Macintosh, the development of the UX of the Macintosh. The Macintosh Finder for about 3 years, and then left there for my first director of engineering role at Berkeley Systems doing screensavers and games, so you know how long ago that was. As Mike said, I've been a director of engineering and a VP of engineering and a VP of products. I encountered Agile in 1999, so 20 years ago, and began training teams in Agile about 10 years ago. And 6 years ago became a full-time consultant focused on helping software development organizations to hum. I have found that every software development organization's knots are unique, but they tend to fall into categories of process, culture, communication, planning, and rigor. And they tend not to be the people. Software development organizations often struggle as we grow, as Mike noted in his introduction. Software development organizations struggle with structure. So startups have to answer the question, when does our team become 2 teams? When have we grown enough? What's the maximum team size? Larger organizations need to answer the question, do we divide teams by components or by user function? Every organization, as our teams grow, we need to answer the question of when and how do we split them. Distributed teams, we need to ask the question of how do we distribute work geographically. Managers, we managers need to answer the question of what's our role and what's the role for the managers in our organization. Enterprises are sometimes asking the question, well, can we can we put all of our developers into a pool, or do we put them, or do we shape them into teams, and what do those teams look like? And then there's that question of what is a team anyway? So we're going to try to answer all of those in the course of this hour. There are a couple of context points for this talk. One of them is this quote from Al Shalloway, who's an Agile author and trainer and coach, who said the point is not to do Agile, the point is to be effective. Agile provides us insights. And so one of the things I want to say about that up front is there are a few trainers out there who say there's one and only one way to do Scrum or one and only one way to do Kanban. But for most of us, what we experience is that Scrum organizations, Kanban organizations, extreme programming organizations that are being effective are leveraging the practices and adapting them to their organizations and their culture and their people and their customers and their executive staff. They're adapting them, and I've never seen two Scrum implementations, by way of example, that look the same. So there's no one answer to this question of scaling Agile teams. There's no one answer to the question of scaling software development teams. But what we're going to do is try to give you some insights. Secondly, developing software as a team sport. This is over the course of my career, I've come to realize that fundamentally, sales may or may not be a team sport. When we send the best salesperson to Hawaii with the CEO to play golf, I tend to think that that's not really a team sport. Those are really individuals who are competing to show their best. But in software development, we really are a team sport. And that means that all of the things that have to do with team sports have to do with software development. So what's the ideal team size? So let's start there. Can you give us some answers in the chat window? And Mike, I'm not going to see them, but you will. So type your answer of what you think the ideal team size is into the chat window. And Mike, would you tell me what you're seeing?
Yeah, I've got a couple answers coming in. Someone says 4. Waiting for some more. 6, 7, 8 to 10. We have one that says 1. 6 to 9, 4 to 10, 5, 8. Another 4.
Okay, a lot of answers. There's at least one 1 in there, and the highest number that I heard was 10, which says if we get into double digits, we don't get into there more than by 1. So let's talk about possible answers. Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, Ron. There is one that says 10 plus.
Okay, 10 plus. All right, so possible answers. So Scrum for 2 decades said the answer to ideal team size is 7 plus or minus 2, which is 5 to 9. The Scrum guide today, I'm told, I didn't go look this up, but I'm told that the Scrum guide today has expanded that range to 3 to 9. It did not increase the number, but it decreased the number at the smaller side to 3 to 9. Jeff Bezos has his 2 pizza rule of 5 to 7. The number of people, the maximum number of people who, if you serve them 2 pizzas for lunch or dinner, you've served enough pizza. My co-author, Mickey Mantle, calls out 3 to 4 and notes a small team will usually outperform a larger team, hands down, which is my experience as well. So my own answer, given that what it is that gates teams, so I'll go back to software development being a team sport, what gates teams is communication and collaboration. My own answer is 1. And so if we look at what gates teams, communication, the lines of communication, if we have 2 people on our team, we have 1 line of communication. If we have 3 people, if we had just one person to that team, we didn't just add one line of communication. We went from one line of communication to 3. If we go to 4, suddenly we've got 6 lines of communication. So lines of communication are multiplicative. So when the Scrum Guide says 5 to 9 or 3 to 9, what it's really talking about, in my view, is the ideal maximum team size. Because the ideal team size is if all the communication is neuron to neuron, if we can have one person who's defining the product and developing the product and testing the product, all of the communication is neuron to neuron, and that communication is very fast. All of the collaboration happens inside one person's brain. J. Richard Hackman at Harvard, who spent decades studying team theory, said research consistently shows that teams underperform individuals. He said problems with coordination and motivation typically chip away at the benefits of collaboration. So what's the issue of team sizes of 1? Well, not very many applications these days that a single programmer can write. Occasionally you get and when mobile apps came along, suddenly there was the possibility of having one programmer writing a mobile app. But mostly that's not the case. And furthermore, there are not very many these days. There are not many full stack developers who can handle every part of an application. So that leads us to an ideal team size perhaps of 3 to 4. As Mickey said, a small team will usually outperform a larger team hands down. And Daniel Pubius, who was the VP engineering at Medium and is now a co-founder of Range, noted that a sole genius isn't going to solve problems in the way that a group can. That group can come together and contribute to each other. But with a team size of 3 to 4, even if we're just working in JavaScript, we're going to end up with stacks of frameworks. So the mean stack involves 4 different frameworks that getting expertise in is tough to do for full stack developers. And then as we, I don't know about your organizations, but in every organization I've been in, that organization's got a list of possible features longer than my arm, and we in startups, company CEOs ideate at a rate that's an order of magnitude faster than we can develop. We just run out of engineering bandwidth. And so team sizes of 3 to 4 are tough to get everything done. So there's that ideal team size of 2 pizzas. Jeff Bezos called out 5 to 7 people. He called out 5 to 7 people depending on their appetites, and I think that's a really interesting observation, because what it suggests is that we don't want to put 5 to 7 recent college grads on a team, because I don't know about your experience with recent college grads, but boy, do they eat a lot of pizza. So we need some senior developers on our team in addition to some junior developers in order for 2 pizzas to be able to feed a group of 5 to 7 people. So then we get into Scrum's organization of 7 plus or minus 2, 5 to 9, or 3 to 9. What they're really saying is fewer than 10. Let's keep it in single digits. And in fact, here's Richard Hackman again from Harvard, who noted that big teams usually wind up wasting everybody's time, and his rule of thumb is no double digits. Mickey, my co-author, said, rarely have I seen productive teams that number more than a dozen. And Ron Quartel, who's the creator of a version of Agile called Fast Agile, I'll mention something about that later, notes that if we work in pairing, if we work in pair programming, that a team of 14 that pairs would be the same as 7 channels of communication, 7 lines of communication with solo developers, which is interesting in that it allows for a larger team to be effective without having to break it up. So I want to say something about stable teams, because the question comes up of, should our teams be stable? Or can we reform teams on a regular basis? And so I'm gonna put out the observation, the personal observation, that I'm a real fan of stable teams, but I'm also going to give you a little bit of insight into an organization that has stable teams at the 60-person level, but not at the team level. So here's Hackman, who says R&D teams do need an influx of new talent to maintain creativity and freshness, but only at the rate of one person every 3 to 4 years. So we can keep stable teams for a really long time, for 3 to 4 years, without introducing a change in one person. And in fact, I don't know about your teams, but the ones I see, it's tough to keep a team stable without somebody leaving over the course of 3 or 4 years. So that's pretty easy to pull off. What Hackman notes is that the problem almost always is that a team doesn't have the chance to settle in. It doesn't have a chance to become stable, to learn through experience how best to operate as a team, to learn where the centers of expertise lie within their team and how to rely on each other. And in fact, that goes to Bruce Tuckman's, the guy who created the stages of group development that probably most of you have heard of forming, storming, norming, and performing. I have to write those down here because I can never remember to get them in the right order. Forming, storming, norming, and performing are the stages that a team has to go through in order to get to performing. It has to go through forming and storming and norming, and that takes time. And it's one of the reasons that I'm a real fan of stable teams is that going through those forming, storming, norming stages really helps teams to get to highly productive, and highly performant stages. It's been my experience that that stability also gives us the ability to get reliable estimating, to get reliable velocity, and to get a high level of predictability that we can get with Agile and with Agile's relative estimating and Agile's velocity measuring practices. So I said that I would note an organization that does not have stable teams at the team level. Rich Sheridan, in his book Joy Inc., and I've talked to him about this. Rich claims that he's overcome the changing teams. So they're a consulting organization. They have 60 to 80 developers at any particular point in time, and they pull together, as most consulting organizations do, they pull together teams to meet projects that as they're coming in. They pull people off the bench and they pull people out of previous projects to form new teams. And so those new teams are the size that the project needs, and they're definitely not stable. And he claims that he's overcome that through extreme programming practices of test-driven development and of pair programming, and that he's even beat Brooks' Law. And I will remind you of Brooks' Law is the law that Frederick Brooks came up with 45 or 50 almost 50 years ago. He said adding resources to a late project will make it later. And that's been true for every organization I've ever seen, but Rich claims he's got that beat. So I'll let you go to Joy Inc. to check that out. So how do we split growing teams? When and how do we divide a team that's got more than 9 people on it? Because once we get more than 9, we've got so many lines of communication that it's unlikely that all of those lines of communication are actually going to take place. So there's I'm going to share 4 approaches with you to think about as you're thinking about your own teams. So 1, keep the team intact. Secondly, cell division. Third is ways of splitting the team, and the 4th is a hybrid split. So let's talk about keeping the team intact. the maximum of 9 is a guideline. It is not a law. But if you allow a team to grow beyond 9, you really need to recognize the communication burden that represents. You need to give focus to communication effectiveness, and you need to be more explicit about ensuring, you as managers need to be more explicit about making sure that communication is effective and that it's happening. And you need to support the reforming, storming, norming that leads to performing whenever a single member of a team changes, and the larger the team, the more support you need to give it. So,
hey Ron, I have a question for you.
Yep.
Think about stable teams and also keeping the teams intact. When you talk about a stable team, you're not talking about like virtual teams where they break off in subgroups and work on elements of the software together. You're talking about just the overall team and how they work together, correct?
So what I really am talking about the sub-teams, provided that we're talking about long-running sub-teams that own a mission or a customer journey that they own from creation of that customer functionality through maintenance of it.
Okay, thanks.
Did that answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, it did.
Okay. So one of the ways that we divide teams is something that people call cell division, and it's about cleaving a small team off of our larger team. So our team has grown larger than 9. How do we divide that? We'll cleave off a smaller group. That smaller group will here's a couple of folks who call this out as a method that they use of finding a smaller area of functionality that a smaller part of the team can be spawned off to address. So now we've got 2 teams. We've got the smaller one that's working on a very well-defined area of functionality. We've got the larger one that's still dealing with the larger, less defined surface area, as Dan Pupius puts it. And cell division is a fairly straightforward and easy way of looking at how to split teams. And so it's a subpart of splitting teams. And so I want to talk about splitting teams in general, and note that you need to give some thought to Conway's law. So the quote there, organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations, is sort of abstract. And so I like Glenn Morrison and Eric Raymond's variants, where they made it much more clear. Glenn said software development organizations ship their organization chart. And to be very specific about that, Eric said if you have 4 groups working on a compiler, you'll get a 4-pass compiler. Those of you who have organizations of teams and are thinking of reorganizing them also need to look at one more variant, which is Al Shalloway's. Al notes that when development groups change how their development staff are organized, their current application architecture will work against them. So application architecture and the way we organize our development organizations are often interlinked in ways that we don't realize until we try to change the organization. So how to split the team? So the easy route for splitting a team is to split by components. And I think it was the traditional way of doing software development pre-Agile. Not every organization did. Some of them formed, what did we used to call them? I'm not remembering it right now, but they did form teams, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But more often than not, we split by components. So we'd have the back end group, the system software group, the UI group, the database group. We would split by components, like-minded, like-tooled, common best practices people together. And it might look like this, where all the web people report to a web manager who used to be a web developer. All the database people report to a database manager who used to be a database developer. All the server people report to a server manager who used to be a server developer, and so on. So, and what we would do if we had distributed teams would be we would distribute them around the world, and we put the business logic people in one place and the web development people in another place, the database people and the QA people and the analytics people in yet other places. And that's got an easy management model to it, because people who, database developers really want to work for somebody who understands what it is that they do. And likewise, web developers and system software developers and so on. So teams each get an attuned manager and mentor and coach. The problem is that our goal is delivering customer functionality and delivering delight to customers. It's not about delivering components. And customer functionality requires multiple components. We can't deliver UI to people without also delivering the business logic and reaching down into the database for data to use in that business logic to actually deliver something through the UI to the customer that delights customers. Customer functionality requires multiple components, and the result of dividing teams by component is that there are incessant inter-team dependencies and communication. The high bandwidth communication is between those layers, and dividing it by teams means that instead of having high bandwidth, the high bandwidth communication inside of the team doesn't solve that. Teams have got to do a lot of talking to each other, and that's I don't know about your organization, but they can be pretty problematic. So the effective route that organizations found way back in the day before Agile, as well as got called out by Agile, is to develop feature teams or cross-functional teams. Our goal is to deliver customer functionality, not components, and so every team has every skill set needed to so deliver functionality. So on the left, we see here are the manager-led component teams that I showed you before. On the right are self-organizing feature teams, each of which has the capabilities, the people on it who have the specialties that result in that team being able to deliver a piece of the customer functionality. Notice that all of the web developers who are in purple in my chart are still reporting to a web manager. So we can still, what we're doing essentially what we used to call matrixed organizations. All of the web developers still report to a web manager. All the server developers still report to a server manager. The horizontal lines are where our management-led organizations are, but the teams are self-organizing teams, are agile self-organizing teams that have the leftmost one has 2 web developers, a server developer, a database developer, and a systems developer, along with a product owner and a scrum master. And so when we've got distributed teams, they change in Agile from putting components in different places in the world to putting feature teams every place in the world, and making sure that each of those feature teams has all of the capabilities for being able to do development and being able to deliver functionality. So same skilled folks are scattered across teams, and each set still gets an attuned manager and mentor and coach.
Hey,
Spotify, yeah. So I was about to give an example of this here.
Okay. Oh, why don't you do that, and then I got a question from the audience.
Yeah. So here's an example. Spotify, Henrik Nyberg at Spotify in Scandinavia built this model, and so you've got a team that's doing the mobile application that can develop the mobile application, all the mobile functionality all the way down through the business logic and into the database. You've got a team that's responsible for everything that's got to do with that upper right part of the UI. You've got a team that's responsible for everything that's got to do with that left navigation part of the UI, and then you've got a team that's responsible for everything that's got to do with the controls down at the bottom. So Mike, your question.
Yeah, so the question from the audience is, from your experience, is it possible to have the same person be on more than one of those self-organizing teams from your previous slide?
So the goal, this is interesting because I got this question last night at a talk I was giving in Santa Clara. We inevitably will have some people who will be across teams. So our architect, typically, we want an architect who is going to look at best practices in all of the areas of design and development, and we want that to be across teams. And so that person is going to be across teams. We may have a UI designer who has to operate across multiple teams because each team doesn't have a need for its own designer. There may be some examples of that. There may be a database developer who has to work across multiple teams. So this is if we had our druthers outside of the architect, perhaps, or the lead UI designer, if we had our druthers, every team would have dedicated folks for every one of those roles. And we've got to adapt this to work for us. At the same time, having any particular developer across teams is problematic for both of those teams. Problematic from an estimating standpoint, from a predictability standpoint, from any time we've got individuals shared across teams, it makes all of our teams, all of our organizations, estimating capability and predictability capabilities at risk. Did I answer all of that question, Mike?
I think that was a good answer, yes. There was a follow-on question. I think this is also related. The question is, what would be the role of a platform manager in the self-organizing teams? Would they look over all the components, or what exactly do they do?
Yeah, so this was actually the talk that I spent an hour and a half giving last night, was what's the role of a manager in an Agile team? So I'm going to say a couple of things about that. One is that we added an entire, while we address managers and Agile in our book, Managing the Unmanageable, we added an entire lesson to when we turn it into video training, and I've given talks, in one of them for Synerzip a year ago or 2 years ago, on what's our role as managers in Agile teams. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that here, but I want to note that we've got a fundamental role in setting the boundaries, in supporting, and I turn back to this because here's a web manager who's got people scattered across teams, in making sure that we've got best practices across all of our web developers, across all of those teams, that we are mentoring and growing those web developers, and that we're doing it as a practice, and supporting that practice. So a server manager supporting the practice of server development, and the database manager supporting the practice of database development. There's a huge role for those managers also in evangelizing what it is that those teams are doing, in removing impediments for the folks who are part of their organizations that are on those teams, and being an escalation point for Scrum Masters to get impediments removed. So and that's a small part of what managers' role is. As I said, I spent an hour and a half talking about that last night.
Yeah, that's good. I see it similar way, so I'm on the same page there.
So here's that Spotify model. So we've got those Spotify teams that are working there. Nieberg calls his team squads. So each of those vertical lines is a squad. He calls the groups of people who report to managers chapters. And each of the chapter heads each of the chapters are manager-led technical organizations, and managers are called chapter leads. So he's best known in Agile for having renamed everything, and having created a model that's pretty interesting to look at, but you have to do this translation thing in your head while you're looking at it. So there's a second trap that I want to call out in splitting teams, and that is that, as my co-author points out, the ideal team size is his idea. If we're going to actually have a team of multiple people working, his ideal team size is 3 to 4. We can really easily break down our organization into really tiny feature teams or squads, and I see them being called pods pretty frequently these days. And the problem is that teams and squads and pods become silos. And if we've got a lot of those, and they're sometimes because they're working in a monolithic code base, or sometimes because they're sharing a backlog of requirements, for various reasons, their high bandwidth communication is needed among pods, and so we need to solve that. And in fact, this becomes a problem for all of us if our organizations grow significantly. Even if we've got teams that are 7 to 9 people, we may well have multiple teams working in the same area of functionality, delivering the same functionality. And so what gates communication, if what gates teams is communication, here we've got 4 pods of 3 developers with only 3 lines of communication. They've got high communication among them, but they're working in the same code base. They're working in the same feature area, with the result that there are 2, 4, 6 lines of communication among those teams, and they're the problematic ones, which are the high bandwidth communication, and team-to-team communication is much more difficult. So how do we solve that? With enough growth, it can be a trap for us all. And so how do we solve that? It's solved a number of ways. And typically we solve it by organizing multiple teams or squads or pods into their area of functionality. So what we want is teams or squads or pods to each have their own mission or customer journey that they're responsible for. But we may have a larger one. So Spotify groups sets of squads into tribes. Zenefit groups sets of pods into what it calls super pods. Here's a picture of Spotify's tribes that Henrik Nieberg published a few years ago. And you can see that there are 4 squads in the left tribe. There are 4 squads in the right tribe. I think that's by example. Each of those squads has its own mission, and the tribe has a mission. So the tribe of the mission of the left hand tribe there is provide fast and reliable access to all the world's music. The mission of the one on the right is enabling high product development speed while maintaining a highly available service. So each of the squads within that tribe is part of that mission, and then each of those squads has its own mission or submission within that. And so it's a way of continuing to grow and continuing to organize, and to organize around outcomes, to organize around delighting customers, to organize around giving teams a mission that they can own and be part of. So I want to move on from the splitting to a problem that organizations see as they grow, and what I came to call the hybrid split. So here's an organization. Organizations will find themselves finding it difficult to see what their sub-team missions are. They can clearly see the things that they need to work on next, but they're not likely to be stable teams for very long. And so how do we deal with that? We've now got 15 people. So I was dealing with this with a client that I was working with a year and a half ago. It was a startup with a team of 15. At 15 people as a single team, it had not been very productive. Product management had identified 3 customer functionality work streams, but they weren't long-running streams of features. They were work streams that if we got these 3 things done, then we could figure out what the next things were. But it didn't feel like we had a mission for 3 teams. Nonetheless, we split the team into 3 cross-functional sub-teams, with the stability still at the larger team level, and they're working in a code base that's monolithic. So what we did with this particular case is we did the planning and demos and retros by sub-team, and where the hybrid model really was with our daily stand-ups. We would have a daily stand-up for the first 10 or 12 minutes. We would have everyone together, all 15 people together, and by the way, we had very effective sharing stand-ups in 10 and 11 and 12 minutes with 15 people. It was really very remarkable, and people were sharing their dependencies, their impediments, and their progress in that 10 to 12 minutes. Then teams streamed out of the common room, and so some of those people were remote and were calling in and would then call into their sub-team, and they would split up by sub-teams in front of card walls and do another 6 minutes of planning, moving cards across their card walls from in progress to done, talking about how they were doing against their sprint plan, whether they were going to make their sprint plan, whether they needed to help each other resolve their sprint plans. And that hybrid model where everybody was together because we were working in a monolithic code base, it was really valuable for people to understand what was going on inside the code base, but then breaking up into those sub-teams where the sub-team had its own temporary mission was a really useful model for this particular organization. And I want to throw out one more model for team structuring that, so I thought a year ago, this month or next month, I've forgotten, I thought I had a pretty good handle on all the different models of Agile that are out there. And what I discovered was that I discovered a new one. I went to Agile Open Northwest and discovered something called Fast Agile. Fast Agile was designed by a guy named Ron Cortell up in Seattle. The organization that was doing it was reporting it out. Paige Watson reported out on his organization of 40 plus. Paige is a developer that was working inside of Fast Agile. And they had an organization of 40 plus. The stability was at 40 plus, and their teams were self-forming every 2 days around the product management's 5 highest value initiatives. They were doing planning every Tuesday and Thursday morning, and they were sharing outcomes every Wednesday and Friday afternoon. And they were literally reforming new teams every Tuesday morning and every Thursday morning to do that. I'll add a couple of notes about it, which was that they were highly extreme programming practices oriented. They were, if they were at least doing pair programming for those 2 days, if not mob programming, and they were always doing test-driven development. So the results were high quality code developed by the people who needed to be working on them. But an interesting model, and one that I'm following now because I think it's really interesting. So regardless of structure, I want to share a few best practices. So one, make onboarding new team members a best practice. So one of the I mentioned I'm a co-author of the study of product team performance. The study of product team performance, we query people on product teams all over the world to ask them first, characterize the performance of your team. Is it high performance? Is it low performance? Is it something in between? And then we ask them about practices and look to see if we can correlate how teams do practices with their the level of performance that they have. One of the things that really intrigued us very early on was that onboarding, those teams that called out onboarding as a best practice, and we're not talking about onboarding people into our company, we're talking about onboarding them into the team. Those companies that called out onboarding new team members as a best practice correlated with the highest performance teams. We went back to them and looked at what percentage of them were calling out onboarding as a best practice, and it was something under 7%. I know from memory, and I'm not remembering, but it is possibly the lowest hanging fruit that most of us have dangling out there to latch onto and improve. To improve our teams. Secondly, plan for architectural guidance across teams. I think that I don't think that very many of us are well served by not having someone who is whether it's an architect or a confab of the team leads, the technical leads out of the multiple teams. But some way we need to have a common architecture across all of what we're working on. There's a huge value if we've got geographically distributed teams to flying them together and having them work together at critical times in the project. I'm working with a team now that's split across San Francisco and Madrid. Bringing those two teams together for 2 weeks was amazing and remarkable and wonderful. I was working with a team 3 years ago in which all of the product managers were in San Francisco, all of the developers were in Australia, and I spent some time talking to all the product managers and said, so how often do you go to Australia to meet with the developers, and what's that like? And 201, they said the 2 weeks that I spend with developers in Australia, we get more work done. They said we do this every quarter. We go over there. We spend 2 weeks over there. And 201, they said the 2 weeks we spend with the developers are more productive than all the rest of the weeks of the quarter put together. Flying geographically distributed teams together is really valuable. And then I'm going to suggest planning cross-team, cross-geography, cross-tech hackathons is delightful. It is really useful for cross-pollinating geography knowledge, cross-pollinating technology knowledge, and cross-pollinating team knowledge. That team I was mentioning that I'm working with now, that we pulled together the Madrid and San Francisco teams, the divide in part was San Francisco and Madrid, but in part it was Ruby and Java, and doing a hackathon of small groups choosing projects to work on for 2.5 days that were not just cross geography but cross technology was a really valuable step. Weekly all hands show and tells have a huge amount of value for companies, and we've been leveraging aligning sprint reviews with those all hands meetings, which gives a higher likelihood of the folks from sales and marketing and the business to sit in on and actually observe and get a sense of what's been done in the sprints by the teams. Remember Conway's Law. You do ship your organization. Make experiments of structure and process change. what makes change hard for most of us is the notion that we're going to make this change and it's going to be like that forever, and we don't know whether the outcome's going to be good, and so it scares us. And if we can instead say, let's try this, let's do an experiment of this, let's try this change for a sprint or 2 sprints or 3 sprints, and let's hypothesize what the outcome is, and then let's actually see what the actual outcome is, and whether and what the effect of it has been. And that is truly agile and truly a way of making change that people can buy into and try and get their agreement around. Create a culture of psychological safety. So Google did its Aristotle study a couple of years ago. For those of you who haven't seen it, the study, Google has enough money to go study everything, and like all of the rest of us, they have high performance teams and low performance teams, and they assigned a team to go and investigate why they have high performance teams, why they have low performance teams, how they differ, and they looked for, well, does it have to do with the individuals on the team? And what they discovered was these 2 words, psychological safety, more than anything else, had to do with how teams became highly performant. And one of the ways they described highly performant teams, and in terms of psychological safety, was that teams that were highly performant, each individual on the team spoke about equal amounts of time. So go look at the Aristotle study from Google, and then don't just do Agile, be Agile. Don't just do Agile practices, but remember that Agile really is about being effective. It really is about mindset. It really is about values and principles. And so the team structure takeaways for today: software development is a team sport. There's no one Agile way to do things. I can't tell you how to make your team work, but I can give you some ideas and some gotchas for what splitting teams will be like. Always remember that the point is to be effective and to delight customers. Organize teams to deliver customer value, and it's a way of getting to being effective and delighting customers. Cross-functional feature teams enable critical communication and collaboration. And we'd probably all stick with teams of 3 if we could, but avoid cross-team communication overhead. So with that, questions, Mike?
Yeah, Ron, let's take the last few minutes to field some questions from the audience. And let's give everyone a couple of minutes to do that. Do you mind going to these next few slides?
Yep.
While people are putting in their questions, I just wanted to talk about SynerZip real quick. Can you go to the next slide, please? So here at SynerZip, we're here to help accelerate the delivery on folks' roadmaps. We're a co-development partner. We have a wide variety of technology skills. We have professionals in both India and the US, and with our type of model, typically folks will save money as part of that. So you get high quality results, saving a little bit of money. Next slide, please. Here's an example of SynerZip's customers over the last 14 years. Some good names here. We're very pleased to have them. Can you go to the next slide? And then coming up, we have a webinar in February, Wednesday the 13th. It's going to be performance reviews that don't suck, presented by Todd Little. I'm anxious to hear that one.
Me too.
All right, next slide. We'll get on to some questions. All right, so there was a question early on about senior versus juniors, and they were interested in your experience, pitfalls, and recommendations related to what the right mix is. 2 to 2, 3 to 1. Is there some magic number?
I have never found a magic number. What I think is really important. So I'm going to go back to that Google study and the Aristotle study of and Agile's notion of self-organizing teams. So self-organizing, what is a self-organizing team? And I think the Google study helps us to define that and realize that a great self-organizing team is a team in which each individual speaks about the same amount of time. And what that means is that senior developers don't override, don't do all the talking. Even the intern leads the team from time to time, because the intern's coming, unless we hired the wrong intern, the intern's coming in with experience out of college, or occasionally out of high school, or out of the development that they've done that is unique to them and that can bring us understanding and insight as well. We certainly want teams that that honor and respect the expertise that each person has, and that absolutely includes the person with the most expertise as well as the person with the least. It doesn't mean that the intern is architecting the application. It does mean that the intern's got something, unless we hired the wrong person, the intern's got something valid to say and has a valid contribution. And we want great teams with a mix of junior and senior developers. And so what I'm always looking for is not numbers, but do we have the right expertise on the team, and do we have the right mix of personalities and of people?
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. One last question. How much does architecture affect your decision on how to split? And from your experience, is architecture a major factor or is it a minor factor?
So it's absolutely a factor. I think we've got to recognize Conway's law in splitting teams. At the same time, I don't want to split along the lines of architecture. I want architecture that we can leverage across the whole of what it is that we're building for customers. And my ideal splits are splits by by customer functionality. I'll call it that. It's giving each team some piece of what it is we're trying to delight customers with that they can truly own.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, with that, we've reached the end of our webinar time, and I'd like to thank Ron and also y'all in the audience for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or we didn't get to your question, feel free to follow up with either Ron or myself. Also, just last reminder that the webinar will be available online, and Jill will be sending that out. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Mike.